Welcome to the special hearing of the Commission of Inquiry for Cambodia, dealing with a number of urgent concerns related to the national elections of July 2023. The determination by the United Nations that the elections cannot be considered free, fair, and legitimate because of widespread human rights and rule of law abuses by the Hun Sen government, and the self-determined transfer of power from Hun Sen to his son Hun Manet that took place on the heels of the national elections. The urgent question that the Khmer community now faces, and that this hearing is designed to help answer, is what can the Khmer community do to deal with these developments and to promote the type of meaningful and effective change that will help bring Cambodia back on a path towards democracy and proper observance of international human rights and rule of law standards. It is understandable that this question is uppermost on everyone's mind, and we want to devote this hearing to providing some reasonable answers that can help to increase your understanding of everything that has been taking place in the past few months regarding the political situation in Cambodia, and to suggest some concrete actions that we can take and must be taking to promote meaningful democratic and human rights reforms. Given Hun Sen's autocratic manipulation of the election results by eliminating any meaningful political opposition, his destruction of key elements of civil society, such as the independent media, and now his self-determined decision to transfer power to his son, Hun Manet, it is understandable if members of the Khmer community are feeling the weight of Hun Sen's authoritarian and highly repressive system of governance and having difficulty seeing how they can make a difference and secure meaningful and effective change. The path towards progress and meaningful reform is not simple or easy, but even in the midst of the worst of Hun Sen's highly repressive and authoritarian tactics, there are important signals and signs of hope that point the way toward effective reform. They start with the surprisingly forceful leadership role that the United Nations has taken on in confronting Hun Sen and condemning his highly abusive tactics and actions. Not only did the United Nations issue a series of high-level reports and statements, making clear that Hun Sen's abusive policies made free and fair elections impossible, they also adopted what they called an action plan of reform measures that had to be implemented in order for the election results to be considered legitimate. A second strongly hopeful sign was that the Khmer community, responding to the autocratic measures that Hun Sen used to destroy democracy and assure his continuation in power without effective opposition, became substantially more active and developed a powerful new voice on the international stage. They adopted an urgent action case alert system, following the Amnesty International model, and established an ongoing in-country monitoring capability to track whether or to what extent Hun Sen was in fact making a serious effort to implement the United Nations reform measures. These two hopeful signs provide a strong foundation for a new set of proposed advocacy activities to take place over the next 6 months that will give the Khmer community a powerful new way to express their concerns and demands at the international level, to speak truth to power, and to demand justice and meaningful reforms on an ongoing basis. These action steps are keyed to 2 major United Nations review sessions on Cambodia coming up in the next 6 months that will provide a unique set of platforms at the international level that will allow the Khmer community to mobilize international pressures against the Hun Sen, Hun Manet government abuses. The best example of how that can work is the 20% increase in trade tariffs that the European Union recently imposed on imports from Cambodia, with very positive results. Another excellent example of how the new set of advocacy actions that are being initiated can have a positive impact was the drafting and filing with the United Nations by the Khmer community of a community-based challenge to the legality and legitimacy of the transfer of power to Hun Manet. That submission cited inconsistencies between the procedures followed by Hun Sen to appoint his son as prime minister and legal requirements set out under both the Cambodian constitution and international law. This complaint also cited the United Nations' own findings that the Cambodian election results were illegitimate as a basis for arguing that Hun Sen could not make this nepotistic appointment of his son just days after the results of a highly questionable, rigged election were announced. This challenge to the appointment of Hun Manet as prime minister is just the first step in a series of major advocacy actions that are planned by and for the Khmer community in the coming weeks. There will also be an initiative to convene a special meeting with foreign governments and to convince them to exert more pressure on Cambodia, tied to the United Nations Universal Periodic Review session taking place in Geneva in May 2024. A very important meeting with the UN Special Rapporteur for Cambodia that the UN is setting up for us. And most important, the May 2024 UN UPR review session and hearing on Cambodia, which will provide a number of opportunities to bring international attention to the Khmer community's concerns. In short, the thoroughgoing nature of the Hun Sen, Hun Manet government's autocratic and repressive system of governance that the United Nations so forcefully condemned this past year presents us with numerous concerns and fears, but they have also created deep concerns in the international community that we can use as a basis for demanding effective change. We need to take up the challenge that Hun Sen and Hun Manet have presented in their high-handed manipulation of the election by finding new and more effective ways of speaking truth to power and challenging their worst abuses at the international level. The United Nations has shown us this past year how stronger action at the international level can produce good results. Let's build on that foundation by joining forces with the United Nations and the international community to demand meaningful and effective change for Cambodia. Paul Huffman, Commissioner of the Commission of Inquiry for Cambodia, Brad Adams, former Asia Director of Human Rights Watch, and Ceylon Ian, Director of the newly created Khmer Urgent Action Case Alert System, are with us today to help us understand and make effective use of the advocacy action plan that has been developed to help us move forward in a more positive direction.
Much has happened since the Commission of Inquiry for Cambodia started its series of fact-finding hearings 2 years ago. Most notably, Hun Sen doubled down on his major human rights and rule of law abuses in order to totally eliminate the only remaining political opposition so as to control and dictate the results of the July 2023 national elections and to extend and solidify his autocratic power. But equally, if not more important, was the reaction of the United Nations, the European Union, and the international community to this unprecedented power grab and Hun Sen's decision to eliminate the last vestiges of a presumed claim of a democratic political system in Cambodia. Instead of remaining relatively quiet, as had happened so often in the past, the United Nations spoke out forcefully at the highest levels, challenging Hun Sen's actions and for the first time openly questioning the legitimacy of Hun Sen's election. The United Nations also for the first time issued an action plan of reform measures, spelling out a detailed roadmap of steps that the Hun Sen government would have to take before the July national elections could be considered and treated as fair, free, and legitimate. Hun Sen did not implement any of those mandated reforms and instead continued to abuse his powers in order to maintain his uncontested hold on power. The dramatic change in the international community's approach to Hun Sen and his abuses establishes a firm foundation for the Khmer community to also act in a new way, to accomplish what Brad Adams of Human Rights Watch referred to as the need to promote meaningful and effective change for Cambodia. The touchstone that the Commission of Inquiry adopted as its primary goal at the start of its work 2 years ago. The key question is, where do we go from here? What steps can and should be taken in the coming months aimed at producing meaningful change for Cambodia, given Hun Sen's solidification of his power and control? How can the United Nations Action Plan of Reform measures be used as a base to move forward towards meaningful change and reform? Let's do that in two ways. First, by identifying the specific reforms that need to take place, and second, by proposing a simple plan of 4 concrete and easy steps to carry out advocacy steps that the Khmer community can take in the next several months to accomplish the reforms that we and the United Nations have identified. As far as the key reforms that have to be made, the United Nations Action Plan of Reform measures provides the core elements. They include, first, reinstating legal status and operational functioning of the principal opposition political parties that Hun Sen had declared illegal and closed down in the run-up to the national election. Second, ending the mass criminal trials and other politically motivated criminal prosecutions and vacating and clearing the records of the many political leaders like Kem Sokha and Thierry Sen, critics of the government, and independent journalists who were criminally prosecuted and sent to jail for offering alternative views to those of Hun Sen and his government. Third, allowing for the reopening and return to functioning status the numerous independent media outlets like Voice of America, Radio Free Asia, the Cambodia Daily, and the Phnom Penh Post, and the Voice of Democracy, that were closed down or had their operations severely restricted to end criticism of the government's policies. Fourth, ending the harsh restrictions imposed on the core institutions of civil society, to allow alternative voices to be expressed and heard, and to assure that citizens' free speech and free association rights are properly protected and observed without surveillance and controls. Fifth, allowing social media to operate without monitoring and supervision designed to restrict and punish criticism of the government. These are not the full agenda of necessary reforms, but the starting points in the direction of meaningful change that the United Nations has mandated. Next, what are the initial advocacy steps that the Khmer community can take in the coming weeks and months to help produce these reforms? The calendar and work plan of action steps takes the lead from the United Nations and the various international forums and platforms that they will be making available that will focus on Cambodia and on Hun Sen's human rights and rule of law abuses. That starts with what the United Nations calls the Universal Periodic Review Process, the UPR. Cambodia's UPR review will feature an official public hearing on Cambodia's human rights and rule of law problems that will be convened in April of 2024. But there will also be preliminary stages of Cambodia's UPR process between now and then that provide opportunities for the Khmer community to submit written and oral statements and complaints that allow groups and members representing the community to speak truth to power and to gain international attention for their concerns. These are all useful forums and platforms at the international level where we can present our views and concerns and advocate for change. But let's not forget what the Khmer community can do in its own right within the community to promote effective change. Sela Nyan's Urgent Action Alert System is a powerful tool to give voice to individual members of the Khmer community and to bring widespread international attention and support for challenging the worst cases of abuse. Finally, we must give prominent attention to Hun Sen's recent transfer of power to his son, Hun Manet. This attempt by Hun Sen to self-select his successor and to keep government under his family's control on an indefinite basis flies in the face of basic principles of democracy and the specific assurances set out in the Paris Peace Accords guaranteeing a democratic system of governance for Cambodia. Self-selecting a successor is not democracy. It is the worst form of dictatorship and autocracy, made even more objectionable by the element of family corruption and cronyism. In the coming months, the Khmer community must challenge this action with every major foreign government, as well as with the United Nations. We must make the right of the Khmer people to choose their own leaders, as guaranteed in the Paris Peace Accords, a primary focus for all of our organizing and advocacy efforts. That is a key direction that all of our future efforts must take. Of course, we must continue to challenge and give attention to the ongoing series of major human rights and rule of law abuses that Hun Sen has employed to remain in power, including his stealing of the 2023 national election by eliminating political opposition. But the weakest link in the systematic exercise of autocratic and abusive control is Hun Sen's transfer of power to Hun Manet by executive fiat. The Khmer community needs to mobilize an international effort to stop this ultimate abuse of power that would permanently and arbitrarily take away the right of the Khmer people to choose through a legitimate election process their own leaders through a democratic system of governance. The international community should not and will not let this final slap in the face of the rule of law and democracy stand. Join with us in the coming months to make our protest against the illegal transfer of power to Hun Manet the linchpin of our efforts to produce meaningful and effective change for Cambodia that will return human rights and the rule of law to the Khmer people. We filed a formal challenge and protest with the UN Credentials Committee relating to the Hun Manet transfer of power. This is an urgent issue. Opposing this illegal transfer of power must be the focus of action and advocacy by the Commission and the Khmer community in the coming months if there is any chance for a democratic future for Cambodia. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Brad Adams. I'm the former Asia Director of Human Rights Watch. Before that, I lived in Cambodia for 5 years, working as Chief of the Legal Assistance Unit of the Cambodia Office of the UN Commissioner for Human Rights. I investigated and saw firsthand the dead bodies from extrajudicial killings by Hun Sen and the CPP. I interviewed journalists and human rights defenders facing death threats and arrest, and I met with villagers being forced off their land to make way for corrupt business deals by some of the richest and most powerful leaders in the CPP, army, and police. So I know the reality just as you do. You may remember that the idea for initiating the work of the Commission of Inquiry arose from an information sharing and strategic planning meeting that I convened and chaired with leaders and members of the Khmer Community on July 18, 2021, almost exactly 2 years ago. The Commission of Inquiry for Cambodia has therefore asked me to provide this review of the work of the Commission and its next steps. For the past 2 years, the Commission of Inquiry for Cambodia has been conducting a series of fact-finding hearings focused on the long-standing human rights abuses in the country, the decreasing space for civil society and independent media, and the increasing use of harsh laws and a politically controlled court system to erase all forms of opposition to renewed one-party rule. As of today, democracy is dead in Cambodia. Our challenge is to find ways to revive and strengthen it. Our efforts have had some important positive impacts, including encouraging the United Nations to take some important initiatives to challenge the Hun Sen government's policies and practices, and encouraging the Khmer community itself to undertake a series of grassroots monitoring and advocacy efforts. Over the past 6 months, a number of United Nations officials and agencies at the highest levels, including Secretary General Antonio Guterres, have issued a series of very hard-hitting statements and reports condemning Hun Sen's human rights and rule of law campaign, and concluding that the scheduled July 2023 national elections could not take place on a free, fair, and legitimate basis unless major reform measures that the UN recommended were properly implemented. And of course, as we all know, they were not. In the end, no democracy outside of Cambodia has recognized this sham process as legitimate. We need to build on this in the coming months. At the same time, inspired by the work of our Commission and the powerful words and actions of the UN, the Cambodian community developed and put into action a major new urgent action case alert system, modeled along the lines of the one so successfully used by Amnesty International in the past, to identify and file complaints at the grassroots level on the most serious human rights abuses and cases. You've also organized a grassroots, community-based effort to monitor and report on whether and to what extent the Hun Sen government was acting to implement the action plan of reform measures that the UN recommended as essential to make fair and legitimate elections possible. And we all know that that did not happen. But given the adamant refusal of the Hun Sen government to implement the UN's recommended reforms, and the UN's inescapable conclusion that the July elections were not free and fair, the international and Cambodian communities must deal with this simple but urgent question. What steps can we now take to move Cambodia on an effective and meaningful path in the direction of human rights, rule of law, and democracy? There's a great amount of experience in Cambodia, but we also need to look at the experiences of other democracy and rights building movements in places like South Africa, Indonesia, the Philippines, and even Myanmar, where, at least for a while, democracy started to take some roots. Each of them had major successes, but also faced setbacks along the way. Each offers important lessons. The unusually strong and very positive actions of the UN over the past 6 months, together with the new grassroots initiatives of the Cambodian community with the urgent action case alert system and community-based monitoring systems, are one part of a longer-term strategy. We must organize an ongoing, long-term, and comprehensive strategy of advocacy efforts if we are going to make a serious effort that will produce meaningful change. Of course, while the UN is important, just as important is advocacy with key governments and parliaments, including the United States, of course, the European Union, and other key countries like France, Germany, Australia, Canada, the UK, Japan, South Korea, Thailand, Malaysia, and Indonesia. I didn't mention China because they would refuse to meet, but of course they are incredibly important. And if the opportunity ever arises to meet with Chinese officials, that opportunity should be taken. Each of these countries plays a key role, or at least has an opportunity to play a key role in pushing for democracy and human rights in Cambodia, imposing sanctions such as Magnitsky sanctions as investors or as key leaders in UN voting on Cambodia. We must keep our eyes open to new opportunities that may present themselves in the upcoming months, such as the possibility of a more democratic government in Thailand. We don't know how it's going to turn out in Thailand, but the public has just voted for change, and we'll see. And it's very important for the Cambodian diaspora to make and create relationships with the new generation of Thai leaders. There's also a new, more progressive government in Germany led by a foreign minister from the Green Party, who is very publicly outspoken on human rights and democracy, and I think we can expect to be a great supporter of the Cambodian democracy movement. We also must react to the kind of stupid and counterproductive behavior of countries like Australia, which issued a really welcome statement criticizing the July 23rd selection, but also announced a large package of development aid at the same time. I mean, this kind of mixed message only empowers Hun Sen to believe that he can continue on his dictatorial path. And I urge all of you to let the Australian government know, how disappointed and upset you are that they would announce a new package of development aid right in the middle of the killing of democracy. We should be pushing the EU to follow through on the EBA process. Hun Sen laughed at the 20% reduction in access to the EU market because he knew this was a half-hearted sanction. But if the EU followed its own law and insisted on respect for human rights for preferred access to its market, things would change in Cambodia. Not everything, because the EBA isn't the answer to every problem, but important progress could be made on subjects such as labor and environmental rights. And remember, we are simply asking the EU to implement its own laws. The same is true with Magnitsky sanctions. Most of the dirty dozen still have not been sanctioned, even though the US, UK, EU, and others have made it clear that they accept Human Rights Watch's report. US Treasury Department and State Department are simply dragging their bureaucratic feet. We need to light a fire under them, including through our allies in Congress. The same is true with the Cambodia Democracy and Human Rights Act. Passage of this through Congress, where Hun Sen has no friends, should be straightforward and a big priority for the Cambodian community. So, while the situation right now is unacceptable, the current situation can, and really it must be reversed. We don't have to accept these manufactured and predetermined results. It's a huge challenge, but it's critical that you work together, drop old rivalries, forge new alliances, and encourage a new generation of activists to join you in this fight. I'm not going to pretend that this is not a huge challenge, but it's one that collectively we have faced and overcome in the past. Otherwise, there would be no 1991 Paris Agreements or no 1993 Constitution, or no contested elections in 1993, 1998, and 2003, which was the last really contested election in Cambodia. So while it's sad and frustrating to be in this position, we know we can do it. It does mark the beginning of a new era and a new opportunity to find effective ways to promote meaningful change inside the country and to move the Khmer community and Cambodia forward on the path to human rights, the rule of law, and democracy. Let's join together to take that path. Thank you.
My name is Sailanian, and I have been serving as coordinator of the Urgent Action Alert System and coordinator of the Khmer Community's grassroots advocacy efforts related to the United Nations' recent series of reports, statements, and findings, making crystal clear in the strongest of terms that the July national elections could not be considered free, fair, or legitimate, given Hun Sen's long-standing campaign of major human rights and rule of law abuses, including the closing down of the main opposition political party and the criminal prosecutions of its leaders in mass criminal trials. I'm thrilled to announce that the inspired Amnesty International model and newly established Urgent Action Alert, which has never been done before in the Khmer community, is now showing signs of success. The community's filing of a formal complaint to the UN challenging the legitimacy of Hun Sen's selection of his son Hun Manet as his successor and the accompanying issuance of an urgent action alert on this situation, providing a basis for the UN Special Rapporteur on Cambodia to lead off his most recent report to the United Nations Human Rights Council in September by accepting the substance of our complaint challenging the legitimacy of Hun Manet's hereditary appointment. The success from the Urgent Action Alert System has captured international attention and support, paving way for new opportunities and providing a strong foundation of advocacy efforts for the Khmer community to engage in. Over the next 6 months, we will be collaborating closely with the UN, participating in a series of meetings aimed at highlighting the human rights and rule of law issues in Cambodia. Before delving into these efforts, I want to share some crucial developments related to the UN and the Khmer Community's initiatives. During our virtual one-on-one meeting on October 6 with the Special Rapporteur for Cambodia, Vitet Mitabon, and UN Cambodia Desk Officer, it became very clear that our grassroots Khmer monitoring efforts, together with our newly developed urgent action case alert system, played a major and highly successful role in moving the UN towards a more forceful and outspoken challenge to the highly abusive policies and practices of the Hun Sen, Hun Manet government. On October 9, the Special Rapporteur presented the latest report to the UN Human Rights Council, outlining the severity of the Hun Sen government's human rights, rule of law, and democracy abuses. The report, along with the accompanying UN media briefing, made crystal clear that Hun Sen's ongoing abuses on civil society and the political process raises questions about the legitimacy of Hun Manet's appointment as Prime Minister, that he refers to as an hereditary appointment. The report also emphasized the necessity for government to adopt comprehensive structural reforms to remedy these abuses. This significant report mirrored the concerns expressed by the Khmer community and must be served as a foundational framework for the Human Rights Council's upcoming UPR review process on Cambodia. These Khmer advocacy efforts are closely linked to the UN's stronger stance internationally rejecting Hun Sen's systematic and long-standing human rights and rule of law abuses that made it impossible to hold free, fair, and legitimate elections. They provide a basis for a new hope that meaningful and effective change for Cambodia is possible. We, the Khmer community, must use every platform and forum available to challenge Hun Sen's arbitrary and undemocratic decision. The upcoming Universal Periodic Review process in April-May 2024 presents a list of opportunities for us actively engage in this challenge against the Hun Sen Hun Manet government. These advocacy opportunities that the UN has provided us starts with an in-country visit to Cambodia by the UN Special Rapporteur, Vitet Mitabon, from December 4th to the 14th, 2023. Early in 2024, there will be a call for submission by the UN inviting input from non-governmental groups. Then in April-May 2024, the UPR session and hearing on Cambodia's human rights issues before the UN Human Rights Council. This pivotal international forum critically examines Cambodia's human rights record, offering the Khmer community a perfect opportunity to bring international attention to their concerns. Finally, in May 2024, there will be an information sharing side event meeting at the UPR review session organized by our Khmer groups to garner support from foreign governmental delegations. As you can see, the UN has opened its doors with a multitude of opportunities to speak truth to power. We must take advantage of this rare opportunity and take immediate action in the coming months. One, attend these UN sessions virtually. They are publicly broadcast, and read the summaries of the UN sessions and actions that we will provide regularly through the periodic urgent alert updates that we plan to issue immediately after each forum or action. 2, let us and the relevant UN officials know what your concerns are. Take every opportunity you can to offer your input. 3, continue to speak out in support of meaningful and effective change for Cambodia along the lines set out by the UN in their action plan of reform measures. This is the guidepost we must follow in evaluating the legitimacy and the sufficiency of the Hun Manet government's actions. A few token releases of 3 or 4 detainees are a small part, but far from enough in terms of the systematic abuses that must be addressed and remedied. 4, one of the most important messages for the UN is how important and urgent it is for the Khmer community to sustain forceful and effective advocacy efforts and continue to make your voices heard. The Khmer community's urgent action alerts are demonstrating the effectiveness of this innovative approach. For the Khmer community, we have now also expanded the Urgent Action Network's capacity for sending out alerts and will continue to play a major role in many of the upcoming UN advocacy efforts. Join us by visiting communitycampaign.org and signing up to receive urgent alerts and additional updates regarding our advocacy efforts for the next 6 months.
The July 2023 national elections, while totally flawed because of Hun Sen's highly repressive policies designed to control the election's results in his favor, have unexpectedly provided a critical turning point for Cambodia and the Khmer people. Not because Hun Sen and his family remained in power as a result of the predetermined election results, and not because Hun Sen used the rigged election results to justify his appointing his son Hun Manet as his successor as the new prime minister, but because two very unusual things happened in the lead-up to the elections. First, the United Nations, in very forceful and clear terms that they had never used before, condemned Hun Sen's repressive abuses and declared in no uncertain terms that free, fair, and legitimate elections were impossible under the harshly repressive conditions he imposed, most especially his having the main political opposition parties declared illegal and instituting mass criminal trials to imprison their leaders and supporters. These findings and warnings were issued through a series of reports and statements by the highest-level United Nations officials and agencies, including the Secretary General, and were accompanied by what the UN called an action plan of reform measures that had to be effectively implemented for free, fair, and legitimate elections to take place. For example, and to demonstrate the significance of the UN's actions, on October 9th, the UN Special Rapporteur for Cambodia presented his latest and most important report and update to the UN Human Rights Council, describing the seriousness of the Hun Sen's government's human rights, rule of law, and democracy abuses. In that report, and in the UN media briefing that accompanied it, the lead paragraph made clear that the thoroughgoing nature of Hun Sen's abuses and their stifling impact on civil society and the political process place into question the legitimacy of what the Special Rapporteur termed the hereditary appointment by Hun Sen of his son Hun Manet as prime minister. His report also found that the extent of Hun Sen's abuses made it necessary for Cambodia to adopt comprehensive structural reforms to remedy the abuses. A few token releases of political prisoners, while a small symbolic first step forward, would not even scratch the surface for ending the campaign of repression in a meaningful way. He pointed to the United Nations Action Plan of Reform Measures as an appropriate starting point and frame of reference for assessing the adequacy of the Hun Sen, Hun Manet government's efforts. Second, the Khmer community itself took its first step towards becoming an effective voice for change at the international level. It developed an urgent action case alert system, modeled after the Amnesty International version, to bring international attention and support to the worst cases and situations of abuse, and introduced a grassroots monitoring capability to assess whether and to what extent Hun Sen, Hun Manet complied with the UN's Action Plan of Reform Measures. These new capabilities and advocacy efforts played a major role in many of the United Nations' recent reports and actions related to Cambodia. For example, the Khmer community's filing of a formal complaint to the United Nations challenging the legitimacy of Hun Sen's selection of his son Hun Manet as his successor, and the accompanying issuance of an urgent action alert on this matter, provided the basis for the UN Special Rapporteur leading off his October 9th report to the UN Human Rights Council with an expression of concern about the legitimacy of this hereditary appointment. These developments will be taking on additional special significance over the next 6 months, as the United Nations and the Khmer Community will be working together on a series of meetings and other efforts designed to bring special attention to the human rights and rule of law problems in Cambodia. That series of events includes a comprehensive review and hearing on Cambodia by the UN Human Rights Council in April and May of 2024 as part of what they call the Universal Periodic Review, UPR process, a detailed analysis of Cambodia's human rights status that takes place only once every 4 years. These upcoming forums and meetings at the international level will provide the Khmer community with a unique set of opportunities to express their concerns and to speak truth to power in an especially powerful way. This is our best chance to take advantage of the positive steps forward that have taken place at the United Nations over the past several months in the lead up to the national elections, to build on our successes in challenging and bring attention to the deficiencies in Hun Manet's hereditary appointment, and to promote meaningful and effective change for Cambodia with the more active support from the United Nations and the international community that we have now been experiencing. So mark your calendars to take part in each of the advocacy opportunities that the United Nations will be providing for us in the coming weeks, including the especially important Universal Periodic Review hearing on Cambodia that the UN Human Rights Council will be conducting in April and May of 2024. A full listing of the advocacy events and opportunities that deserve your attention, involvement, and active support in the coming weeks is scrolling across your screen right now. Make note of them. Take part in each of these efforts in an active way. Help us take the next step towards building the international pressures that are needed to promote effective change and progress for Cambodia and the Khmer people. We will use the newly developed Urgent Action Alert System, as well as other information sharing methods, to keep you advised of what is happening and how you can become actively involved on an ongoing basis. We need all of you to become active participants and effective advocates for a better Cambodia.